share with you some ideas that we are discussing in the Compass NUT inquiry into education, but I'm also going to make some international references too, and then eventually end up focusing on you, an inclusive sixth form college here in Hackney. I used to live in Hackney, although I understand the demographics are changing, yes, quite markedly, yes, but I'm sure that your role is still one of trying to be inclusive. The fact of the matter is this, is that the comprehensive experiment of the 1960s and 1970s never ultimately succeeded. It was a partial change for a whole number of reasons that are listed here. There was a focus on the common school, and under the Wilson government, and then in the 1970s, even under Margaret Thatcher in the early 1980s, a number of selective schools, grammar schools, went comprehensive. But of course, grammar schools continue to exist in places like Trafford, particularly in Kent. Right? So what happened was that the common school, which in a sense represented the essence of the idea of comprehensiveness, continued to coexist with a selective system in many parts of the country. At the same time, the curriculum itself was nowhere near comprehensive. So you had changes in organisation, but not changes in curriculum. You had O-levels, well, they were the more selective form of GCSE, the ones that Michael Gove wants to go back to. And then in the early 1970s, you had CSE, so you had a two-tier system. That was only resolved to some extent, ironically, under the Conservatives in the 1980s with the Common Examination GCSE, but it wasn't associated. GCSE was not associated with the comprehensive school system. And certainly, it never extended post-16. Then we continue to have A-levels for a few. At the end of the 1970s, you had a mass transition from school to work, but that collapsed. At the end of the 1970s, with youth unemployment. So the term comprehensive was never applied in any sense as a systemic term. And then what happened in the 1980s? It was simply overtaken by political and economic events. That's to say, three terms of Thatcherism. So, even though in the early 1980s Margaret Thatcher had to sign off a number of comprehensive schools, local authorities doing this, by the time the end of the 80s came, early 90s, we were into a highly selective, more privatised and divided system. So what happened was the comprehensive ideal as a system idea, which had developed only in a partial form, was pretty well dead. What continued were institutions that thought themselves as comprehensive. So the idea went on, but it was in a very, very fragmented institutional way. And I think that remains the case today. Now, incidentally, there are many academies, and I'm not in favour of academisation. There are many academies that would, in fact, consider themselves to be comprehensive institutions. There are several academies that are part, many academies are part of the cooperative school movement. So the comprehensive ideal has been kept alive by teacher unions, by individual teachers in classrooms, by institutions, I would say institutions like your own. Because I'm familiar with the offer that you made, that you're not just an A-level institution, yes? You're for vocational qualifications at level 3, 2, and 1, yes? So you have a broad spread. That to me is one of the first signs of being a comprehensive institution. So it was an unfinished project. It's best to know your history, yes? And also it fell out of ideological favour with New Labour. I mean, I think it was Alistair Campbell who coined the phrase, yes, the bog standard comprehensive. And there was a belief in New Labour that this kind of school could not attract everybody. I mean, Hackney Downs, remember, was bulldozed, yes, and up, yes, in its ashes, yes, arose the Mossbourne Academy. So it was Labour that started the sponsored academies programme, and also specialist schools. They thought they were trying to do anything to keep the middle classes from fleeing to the private sector. So in effect, the comprehensive experiment was somewhat discredited. But things changed. And what I want to do now, I just want to move to another level and to discuss briefly some of the international trends that are demanding educational change and how this influences a new concept of comprehensive education. We live in interesting times. On the one hand, economically speaking, there's firms like Amazon. Did you see that film on Amazon? I mean, it was a kind of a Taylorist paradox, yes? You know, it was man as machine, yes? So that, and the car factory. I mean, in one sense, the Fordist production, mass production paradigm still exists. McDonald's is, in fact, yes, is a kind of a manifestation of that. But there's something else happening within neoliberal capitalism. It's like an eruption from inside it. So if you go down to the bottom of Hackney, you go down to what's called Silicon Roundabout, you'll see a different type of economic formation taking place. Yes? Small, yes, high-tech firms, much flatter, entrepreneurial, digitization. There's a whole set of changes taking place. The phones that you have in your pocket, pretty well everybody's got a smartphone. Yeah? Now, I'm not saying that smartphones lead to a much more knowledgeable world. I mean, if we actually look at the impact of digitization thus far, there seems to be a global surge of opinion rather than a global surge of knowledge. But the potential for lateral communication is unparalleled. I mean, it's interesting that GCSHQ, yes, and the NSA, yes, are happily, as it were, snooping on us, yes, in unparalleled ways. At the same time, people are communicating with each other right across the world. The world has suddenly grown incredibly smaller as a result. And it means that there are new possibilities in terms of work organization and new possibilities in terms of social empathy and relationships. We are literally going through a revolution. It's called New Times. And New Times is happening without you, even when you're not looking. Things are happening around us. Now, usually, education falls behind that curve, by the way. Yes? Education is never in front of a curve of anything. Right? It's always behind the curve. For understandable reason. But we have got to understand this eruption from within neoliberalism that presages a potentially more progressive era. Because it means people have got to be relating to each other. Now, I'm not a fan of Facebook, right, or Twitter, even though I have several followers. I don't deserve it, they've never been on this. Right? But I know something's afoot. And probably the young people who are not here tonight probably know better than us, yes, what is afoot. Now, if we have the potential of this flatter, more relational, potentially democratic world, then we are going to need a version of education which is equal to it. And that means when we start to talk about comprehensive, we're going to have to talk about the type of knowledge and skills and attributes that young people, our lifelong learners are going to have, and the kind of organizations we're going to have to forge and systems that we're going to have to create. Now, if we look internationally, we find very interesting developments. Now, you'll have all heard of PISA. Yeah? In fact, these are the global tests applied by the OECD to 15-year-olds, and they're having a tremendous effect on policymakers. I was just in Wales last week. They're talking with policymakers there, and they've slid down the PISA league, and there's a complete political panic, yes, inside Wales. You know, the concept of a Welsh education crisis, and therefore they've suddenly changed their curriculum, so double maths, GCSE. And we've got Elizabeth Trust running around Shanghai, trying to discover how to teach maths. Actually, the interesting point about Shanghai is they exported 2/3 of their underachieving students to the countryside. Yes? Right? So Shanghai is not actually typical of the rest of Shanghai district, never mind China. Nevertheless, everybody's responding to global trends, but they're not responding in the same way. while PISA is kind of part of the data policeman, as it were, yes, of the global system. There are these three different models of education development. The first is the Anglo-Saxon model, the one that we're in, where you have the primacy of standardized curriculum, of testing, accountability, yes, market forces and so on. Yes, recognize that script? We've had it pretty well for the last 30 years. And that script has spread through the Anglophone countries, including the United States, and it is clearly a model in itself. There's also an Asiatic model, which is not so market-driven, but actually is driven by centralized states, yes, non-democratic states. But there's also, in a sense, a real sense of familial involvement in education, notion of social conformity, leading to high standards. And this is what Elizabeth Truss is interested in. And if you read the articles about Shanghai, you'll just see, you'll see rote learning, cramming, testing, 15 hours, study a day in a very, very competitive atmosphere. Fastest road to mental illness, I think I can know. That is not for our students. We have to go on more creative roads than that. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is a kind of a fusion between the Anglo-Saxon and Asiatic models. I mean, what they lack is democracy. But there is the Nordic model. Now, we've all heard about Finland, yes, in its high levels of performance. They've done that not by going down the marketized road, they haven't gone down that by the conformity road, they've done that by high trust, high quality teachers, yes, open curriculum, exploration, and basically, in a sense, the lack of social inequality. It's kind of the pervasive middle-class attitude towards education. And they've been able to absorb immigration into those societies. And still, they're high-performing systems. And I think we should, the interesting thing there, if you went to these countries and you talked about the comprehensive ideal, they would say, actually, I think that's us. Even though they are under pressure, they would actually recognize the term. So there are models that we can be actually looking at. Now, quite clearly, our coalition, you've got to give it a go. I mean, he's audacious. I mean, it's interesting. You might know that your principal, right, is a left. It's quite a hard line left here. Okay. Yeah, you might have a bust of Marx and probably Lenin, yes. But he's also, I'm sure you'd admire a Gramsci as well. On a Gramsci. And what's interesting about Michael Gove, he said, well, I've studied Gramsci, but he hadn't. He was just quoting from Gramsci. And what Michael Gove, when we talked about Gramsci, we said, because Gramsci had argued that in order that the working class become, in a sense, the ruling class, but not by force but by consent, it had to develop its own intellectuals, and these intellectuals had to do hard things. And Gramsci was very critical of an experiential curriculum. Gramsci argued that basically, learning wasn't always fun, it was hard work, it was painful. And so he argued that actually the sons and daughters of the working class had to do the maths and the science, yes? They had to do the specialist subjects in order to be as good, if not better, than the ruling class. Well, Gove thought, hold on a minute, that's what I'm arguing. But of course, Gramsci linked that, of course, to the working class movement. Yes, that's just not Gove's political project, right? What Gove wants to do is to ensure that sufficient members of the working class, yes, can join the ruling class project. It's called incorporation. Yes, it's called a grammar school in every town. But what he was right in his audacity in quoting Gramsci, he was also quoting a truth. That a comprehensive curriculum, I'm going to come to this, is not simply about project work, right? It's not simply about vocationalism. It's not simply about experientialism. It has to have inside also specialist subject knowledge, the difficult things. And what's interesting about this college, it doesn't just go down, as it were, the experiential road. It has a concept of academic rigor, yes, as well. And the try and integrate that into its curriculum and educational. But this is not the road that the coalition is going down, because despite the fact that Gove, as it were, quotes Gramsci, Gramsci was also interested in the work of John Dewey. Now, the great American educationist. Now, Dewey was interested in vocational education and also the experiential. So how could Gramsci do two things at once? Well, the interesting people always do two things at once. It's not one thing or the other, yes? It's academic rigor and experience, yes? It's knowledge and skills. It's not the world of verses, it's the world of Anne. And the world of Anne is far more interesting than the world of verses. So the question is, do you operate the world of Anne inside this college, yes? Rather than the world of verses. But before I do that, I just want us to cast our minds to the young people in this college and elsewhere. I have 4 children, one of the reasons probably why I'm still working. But I am privileged compared with them. The young are the new poor. They face unprecedented problems. Not only of debt, but of worklessness, or low-paid work, or part work, and a housing crisis. It's a multiple crisis. So let us not forget that here in us, and we're not all at the same age, I can see that, right? But there is an intergenerational crisis, and there should be intergenerational justice. So we are serving them in order that they can have as of the opportunities that we have had. That's going to be difficult, by the way, because some of us are part actually a privileged generation. But we have to know, yes, where our obligations are, and it is to the young. And not only are they excluded from these opportunities, or certainly rationed, but there's been a growth in mental health issues. I mean, you'll see them in this college, yes? The anxiety that young people feel, being precisely in the environment that I've just described. Now it seems to me, if this is true, then education by itself cannot solve the problems of education. If education has to align with other forces, the economic forces, the social forces, the political forces, there is no educational solution in its own right. Because if you thought that, then you'd have education without jobs. And we know that, yes? At the end of the day, you cannot have education without jobs. Education is not a substitute, yes, for the labour market. You have to find a new relationship between education and the labour market, between education and work. And if education is to be part of that movement of new times that I've just described, and it seems to me that all of us should be thinking not only as educationists, but as economists, politicians, just people interested in culture, relationships. We have to expand our notion of professionalism. So we have some choices to make at this particular point. What kind of economy do we want? An hourglass economy? Because the hourglass economy, you know the shape of the hourglass? The hourglass economy is the one where level 3 jobs are being hollowed out. What's interesting, 20, 30 years ago, there were jobs that 16, 17, and 18-year-olds could go to. They are in real short supply now, and really in short supply in London, by the way. London's an education capital, it's not an employment capital. The real problem about level 3 jobs, yes, the intermediate level jobs, that went with manufacturing, yes, that went with parts of the public sector. Real problem with that. But on the other hand, Robert Murray talks about the development of the social economy, which is more transactional. In fact, economic activity is diversifying, and I think we have to really have a look at what's happening in the economy so that your young people also understand what's there and what is coming. It's not just Silicon Valley either. So there are choices to be made about economic direction, and that's fought out in national politics and general election. One thing we can say about this present government, it thinks the deficit is everything. Right? It just wants to bring it down. It has fitted away 5 years of economic restructuring. we are no further forward in terms of productivity and economic restructuring than we were at the end, yes, of 2008. It's literally going to be a lost decade of that. It's a crime shame. We need a Green New Deal, right? So that's what we've got to think about, yes? What kind of economy do we want? What kind of social vision do we have? You will be familiar, I hope, with the work of Pickett, and I'll remember the other one, the Spirit Level, in which they argued with epidemiological evidence that Pickett and Wilson, that less divided societies just work better than divided societies. You spend less money on security, yes? You spend less money on incarceration, right? So that your public spending is not negative public spending, it's positive public spending. How much of our public spending is what you call negative remedial public spending? Where we could resolve all of that by having more equal economic relations in the first place, yes? Instead of wasting money, as it were, yes? On just simply remediating, yes, the ills of capitalism and regularly going to war. There are choices to be made. And what kind of system do we want education? I spent the last 25, 30 years arguing for a more unified system of a closer relationship between academic or general education and vocational education. And not to have, as it were, not to have the following slogan. I think it was a German social democrat in the 1880s who said that general education was the vocational education of the ruling class. The vocational education is the general education of the working class. No, we don't need that. So what is this comprehensive idea in this changing world? In the system terms, I'm going to suggest is the following. First of all, what are your values? Because unless you know your values, unless you know what drives you, you will be driven either by the central state or by the market. It's only by knowing your values that you can go here together and to strike out a course, yes, which is not simply, as it were, prone, yes, to the top-down effects of, yes, of the central state and of the market. Now, I know I could safely say that here, because I observed a few things on my way in, yes? In fact, all those rather shiny posters that surround your college, right? Yes, advertising what you do. But I know that there's a strong values system here. And the point I'm making is, make it stronger. Because it's what keeps you together and what actually, at the end of the day, influences your activity. And then the students will know it, yes? Because it should, come out of every pore of this organisation. And what are those values? I mean, I would argue the values of a good society, which is fairness and social justice, democracy, that's involvement and voice, sustainability, because we have to have that, because we're in the middle, we're the beginnings of an existential climate crisis, resource crisis. Well-being, because we suffer from a social recession. Well, we don't just suffer from an economic recession, we're suffering from a social recession. And you know that what people need actually is people. And this, by the way, this is the limitations of Twitter and Facebook, because while in fact people do conduct their relationships there can be an absence of intimacy if you just simply go too far. Yeah? I wouldn't regard myself really as a digital elite, but I do use my iPhone, although my sons say it's wasted on you, Dad. Why have you got that phone and I haven't? Hand it over now. But face-to-face is terribly important, dreadfully important. I have found that students have an insatiable appetite for human touch. And if you can give them that, that's what they do with it. belief that everybody's educable. Everybody's educable. If we think back over 50,000 years, that in fact this is the time span of behaviourally modern humans. What distinguishes behaviourally modern humans? Well, they think as well as do. And if we think as well as do, and our doing is related to our thinking, yes, then education, everybody can do it. There are some people who think only some people can be educated, yes? No, everybody can be educated. And what adult and community education shows, by the way, that educated music, remember that? Yes? The flourishing that can take place, yes, often at the end of your 20s, by the way. When you suddenly face up the fact you're an adult, you have responsibilities, yes, yes, and regrets, yes? Right. Everybody's educated. Let's never ever forget it. And therefore we find a way through which everybody can be educated. Notice the terms I'm using, educated, not just learning. I'm suggesting there may be something in the word education and not just learning. Right? We'll go back and argue that one out. We do need a new curriculum. Now, I made the point about the importance of specialist knowledge, but we have to apply knowledge in the world in which we live. And often young people are confronted by a subject and simply, well, do them because you should pass an exam. They might say, why? What's the purpose of this? And we have to defend the purposes of these things and explain them. Their uses to, yes, their uses aren't simply, as it were, a currency to pass an exam. We have to defend the uses of knowledge in the modern world because you're preparing young people, yes, to go into that world. But often they have to confront things they find difficult. I think this is why I'm in favour of baccalaureates, because what's interesting about A-level system is it allows people to avoid their demons. My eldest son, who's incredibly talented, came dancing home at the end of year 11 and said, well, that's the last maths I ever did. That was a very intense moment. Now he's got by without it. Is he any better for that? I mean, in France, if you're doing any of the baccalaureates there, if you've got a problem with maths, you've got a problem with maths, and you've got to do something about it. We just go and avoid it. So what kind of character trait is that we're trying to develop in our youth? But, and Elizabeth Truss note this, if we think that certain forms of knowledge and skill are important, we've got to make them accessible. You don't make them, listen, you don't make them at a cliff face. I mean, the illogicality of our system is we make certain forms of knowledge elective and voluntary and difficult to achieve. I mean, what a toxic mix that is. Instead of making everything compulsory and accessible. That would be more sensible. When I was in Wales, they talked not about steps, they talked about a ramp. So think of your provision like a ramp. That's why some of us are interested in level 2.5, by the way. You heard of this? Yes? Not just yes, level 2, but level 2.5. Something, a planned 3 year 6, for example. Now, I know that's been had the legs kicked from under it by the funding on 18-year-olds, right? But if something is difficult, then organise the gradient so people can climb it. Should be beyond the wit of us to design a curriculum to do that. And it means that we have to do much more. Not just specialist knowledge, but research work. I'm a real fan of the extended project qualification. I know it's a bit tick box. I have a much more rigorous version of it, but basically I do your dissertation, where you can do it in different forms, project form, artifact form. And I'm also very much in favour of young people defending their work orally in front of panels. It's called Vargas. I've seen 10-year-olds do this. I've seen 10-year-olds do this really, really well. So we need a new level of social relationships, oracy, as well as it were, tackling different subjects, difficult subjects in a theoretical sense. And we also have to develop a form of vocational education which is really about practice. I was with the Gazelle group of colleges last night. They're into entrepreneurship. And they had students there, and they were talking. Actually, the students were demanding a voice and shaping the curriculum, which was very interesting to hear, by the way. Could we be involved, please? He said. And when the students were asked what they wanted, they said, actually, we want far more work-based activities. So let's try to sum this argument up. On the one hand, very rigorous theoretical stuff, yes? But some of it is quite traditional, looks a bit Govian, yeah? Although we would question the boundaries of those subjects, we wouldn't just accept the world that was given. At the other end, vocational activity that's really rooted in workplaces, really rooted in practice. And those much broader connecting skills, research, relational skills, people skills, that actually make a huge difference to people's engagement with wider life and the ones that employers say they want. This means, and I know I'm talking to an audience, in fact, who try to do this, but do you still do these things? Yes. You do? Yes. Right. That's to say, you've accepted, and I'm just playing back to you conceptually what I think you are doing. You've accepted that qualifications are not enough. And that something else has to happen to build social and cultural capital. The kids are happy, yes, or elsewhere. Qualifications are not enough. So that's why, in fact, you were practicing in a sense of baccalaureate. But curriculum has to be supported by collaboration between institutions. Now, I don't know what your relationship is with the institutions around you. I can't remember. I imagine there's a fair bit of competition happening. Yeah, yeah. Although I've been asked by David Plunkett, and I produced a note for his middle tier review on collaboration. I know that there was an incoming Labour government. There would be a new accent on institutional collaboration. We have got to have people working together, not working against each other. Employers, by the way, are not impressed by institutional competition because it means different people turn up on their doorstep. They much prefer that education cooperated and then had a joint approach towards the employers. It would make much more sense for them instead of everybody traipsing up to them. Yes, saying, "Can I have work experience, please?" So we need a much more coordinated approach in relation to those work experience braces that are actually still rather precious. So it's about so it's not just about your own vision. I doubtless that is strong, but also how you reach out to others, not just vertically to universities like Oxford or what have you, but how you, even in a hostile and different environment, reach out to other providers to meet the needs of all students in an area. I think, in this one sense, we should have Hippocratic oaths for education, in which, institutional leaders, you imagine they do this, yes, put your hand on your heart, right, and say, I dedicate myself not only to BSix, yes, but to the young people of Hackney, yes, yes, and I will work with everybody, yes, to make sure that we fall into 100% of the learners, yes, even though you're doing your level best. Now, if we believe in centrality of values, a new type of balanced curriculum, and much more, the comprehensive idea is not just based on the institution, but based on a comprehensive area, yes, a strong area, working together in the interest of 100%, then what kind of professionalism do you need? Now here we've had a creative argument with the Institute for Learning, because they've argued for dual professionalism. Dual professionalism is made up of two personalities, and I'm sure that you recognize these two things. First of all, you are a specialist in terms of knowledge, a particular area, yes, a subject, or an area of vocation. You're an expert in that, you should be constantly updating yourself. Secondly, you're an expert when it comes to pedagogy and the organisation of learning and assessment. So in fact, you know how to organise the curriculum, yes, deliver it, yes, and get the best out of the learners. Now, if you do both of those in effort, you're doing very well. What's interesting, by the way, is the government thinks you only need persona number one. So anybody can come in who's a vocation expert, yes. And where did you get persona number two from? Oh, just pick it up as I go along. I know you have to become a pedagogic expert. That's what, in a sense, some of these sessions are about. But we're suggesting a third persona, and that is your ability in these new times to work across boundaries, to work with professionals who are not in education, yes, to work with employers, to work with social services, yes, to work in this much more complex society because of the interdependency of different aspects of the locality, particularly when you're trying to meet the needs of the most vulnerable learners, who themselves will have to benefit from multi-agency working. So the third persona is an outward-looking one, as it were, within the institution and beyond. What we call triple professionalism. And if you look at the best practice inside the health service, it's precisely that. I mean, you've all had relatives, I'm sure, in the NHS. And sometimes you see professionals kind of circling around the patient. Yes, not quite getting the drift of it. Yes. Right? You know, is anybody talking to anybody else around here? Right? Well, that shouldn't be happening. Right? It's when people really do talk. And Angus Strong, in his work on the Helsinki clinic, has the patient as the boundary object, right? And then the different professionals are working with each other, psychologists, clinicians, who are trying to understand each other's professionalisms, because not everybody's been inducted in the same way. That's what we mean by that. And above all, I think, we have to accept and to celebrate the fact that there should be a new relationship between education and working. Now, for some people on the left, it was the case that school is bad but work is worse. Right? We're saying that's gone. We have the potential for new forms of production, entrepreneurism, new forms of social enterprise. We have the possibilities of a new type of economy in which education plays an incredibly integrated role. So this is about your interface with working life. So that education is not simply for worklessness, yes? It's not simply a postponement, it's a form of engagement. Because young people want to become something. If you look at the work of Helen Colley, she was studying nursery, young women becoming nursery nurses, and then young men becoming engineers. And what's interesting is that I found in FE colleges, general further education colleges, that people like wearing a uniform other than a school uniform. They can't wait to get into, yes, a uniform. Yes, whether it be the overalls or, in fact, I remember at City of Bristol College, smart young women coming out dressed in black with Kirsty on it, yes, right? And she was, in fact, it was hair and beauty, yeah? Because they were becoming somebody, they were taking on a vocational identity. What in your college, can you get this idea of becoming, yes? Either becoming an academic, yes, a scholar, and interesting your relationship, yes, with Pembroke, yes, and what you do, that young people want to become, they want to assume a new identity. How are you helping that to happen? And that's through forms of integration, progression integration, the world of work. So, to finish, what makes I talked about the components of a comprehensive system, but what makes a comprehensive college? Well, some of this, I hope all of it will be familiar to you, but I want to play it back to you. First of all, it would seem that central to it would be a commitment to inclusion, social justice, and equality. You're here for everybody. I think you made a decent list of this. Right. But it's then what you do with them. Yes? I mean, and the horizons you open up, and the possibilities that you show them, and actually you'll not take no for an answer. You will insist on it, yes? Because they can do it. I remember interviewing, it was through the BSix exercise, yes? And we were library, yes? Some of your students for an award. And on a number of occasions this morning, during this morning, it was a few years ago, I interviewed people who had come here, and one young woman said to me, she said, well, I flunked my first year in a school in South London, and I looked around. You know, I could have gone to South London. I've travelled all the way from South London here. I said, well, that's a long journey. This is before the new train was going on. And I says, what do you think of it here? She goes, it's fantastic. I think I can do anything. And I said, what do you do? She said, I'm a student ambassador. And I said, what does that mean? Well, I said, first of all, I've got to turn the lessons on time. She says, if I'm going to be an example to other people, it's my behaviour on the block. By the end of the morning, I'm now in tears for it. The second room that is. Because we were moved by his experience. Because the college was obviously giving something that's a really short. And I just want to remind you that that's so precious. Absolutely precious. Secondly, even if your principal is a bit of a Stalinist, right? I'm sure he also has a bit of Julius Nyerere. He was the president of Tanzania. And I remember because I was in Tanzania quite regularly. I joked to your colleague here very badly in Swahili. And I saw a picture, a little picture of Nyerere, known as Mwalimu, the teacher, yes, father of Tanzania. And the poster went something like this. It says, involve the people in decision making in democracy. They will make mistakes, but it will be worth it. So, giving everybody a sense of ownership. Yes, sometimes mistakes will be made. Yes, actually, it's what you learn from the mistakes, which are the important things. So, while in fact Ken offers obviously inspiring leadership, he will know, right? I want to get out alive, Ken, so he will know that really his leadership must be distributed, yes? So that you feel a real sense of responsibility. And you feel a real sense of ownership. And it's only by having the collective values that you will exercise that sense of responsibility and that sense of ownership. Because you won't have to be told what to do, you'll know what to do. It's simple as that. But also that you are experts in your own right. You're vocation experts, academic experts, and you're good at teaching, you're good at organising learning, and you always want to improve. Yes? And at the end of the day, well, not the end of Friday, it's your conversations with one another that will improve. Yes? Remember, there's gold in everybody's head. Yes? The question's getting out. It's there. And then understanding what you want to do with students. I talked about the ramp, yes? Yeah? If anything decent is, anything that's worth having is a struggle to have. And in organising the ramp, sometimes you have to help you. Think of this in terms of location. Do you walk ahead of the learner? Do you kick them up the arse? Or do you walk alongside them? I quite like the idea of walking alongside. Yes? In Swahili, yeah? To accompany somebody part of the way. Right? Okay? To walk alongside. And sometimes you might hold their arm. But he said at some point you're not going to have to let this. You're going to have to let his arm go. Yes? And then, yes, up the ramp you go. Right? So holding hands, letting go. Yes? Tutoring people for the climb. Yes? I used Kilimanjaro, by the way, as well. Yes, there's 19,000 feet, yes. When my doctorate students say, well, there's three parts of Kilimanjaro. There's a woodland, and then you out on the slope till there's a peak. Right? And in part of the journey, we help you with the woodlands, yes. But I said, the next part of the exam is the institution focus study. It's preparing you for the peak, yes. It's much harder, it's much bigger, it's 20,000 words, right? Yes. The peak itself is the dissertation thesis, 40,000 words, yes. So we have the idea, the narrative that you take people through stages ready, yes, to prepare them, to get them, yes, acclimatized, yes, prepared for the peak. Think of it, yes, a journey like that. My students understand this and it kind of slightly works with the idea of doing the peaks.
If you think about independent schools, I've got a lot of time for independent schools actually. I've worked with them, I've worked with HMC, I've been in more boarding schools than I care to remember. I've had 2 visits to Eton, by the way, and I just remember what sticks in my mind in talking to a year 13 student of Eton, an Indian lad from Slough, so he's only 3 miles from home, yesterday in Eton Village. And I said, what do you think of that place? He said, it's amazing. This is where I got from. He said, I'm surrounded by people who think they can do anything. Now you might say, well, that's David Cameron born to rule and all that stuff. Right? The fact of the matter is, he was surrounded by people with an amazing amount of social confidence. But also there's an amazing amount of opportunity. At boarding school, everything kicks off around 8:30. They have to organise their own societies. You know, you go to Manchester Grammar School, 128 societies. So you do 4 A levels and you've got the rest of the world, yes? It's called the core curriculum. You've got to have the wider challenges. And I think this is what you do. I would just say, if you do, go back and look at it again. The wider challenges are the ones that really enrich the experience of young people, as well as that academic, yes, vocational growth. Because actually, that's what privileged kids get. Yes, they do gap years. Working class kids don't do gap years. Right? That's one of the reasons why we took CBC students out of Tanzania, the vocational level 1, level 2 students. We gave them a gap experience. Interesting, in Ireland, in the Irish Republic, they have a thing called the transition year. It's a kind of not a year off, it's just a year off the curriculum. And they do different things. So it's about, incidentally, all the work on neuroscience and on synaptic development and pruning in the brain is beginning to lead us to understand that what young people need, well, actually adolescents, but all of us need different experiences. Because we all live inside our comfort zones. One of the reasons why I look forward to learning Swahili to get my brain got used to Swahili. But actually, it's a new kind of activity for me. Yes? So get outside your comfort zone, get new experiences, take on challenges. I say to myself, that to myself as I get older. Remember, as you get older, you draw the world around you. Yes, of course, don't you? And also, just learn to value each other as a community of practice. You have different communities of practice, you have people in departments, but value each other and what you know. Remember, the real resource is the society and the wider social. I'll finish on this. I think we're at a point where we have got to get our act together, really to influence the labour policy. We're not going to influence this government. Quite clear. It's the Tristram Hunts of this world, yes, and the front bench of it. I do believe they will form part of the government in 2015, yes, either narrowly by themselves or in conjunction possibly with the Democrats. I think they are casting around for ideas. They haven't been exactly up front with the alternative goal, have they? Yeah? That's been abject. But it's better than Stephen Twigg, obviously. That's pretty low bar. Ideas have got to come from the profession. You are practicing mental idea work. I just come along to your course. You've got to get yourself involved in your own sector with the idea of educating all, progression ladder for all, demanding new types of relationships, and being proactive as an education profession. Because I'm sure you didn't come into this just to teach you theory, yes, to make a better place to live, yes, yes, and a better world to create. I think you're in a great place, by the way. One of the reasons why I'm honored to be here is not only because of sterling work that your leadership has done, but the work that you do every day. With learners who often are reluctant, I'm darn sure, yes, reluctant, disillusioned, right? So it's not easy, I understand that. But I have to say that you should be very proud of the work that you do, because you're not just working with the curriculum, yes? Yes, you're working right across the board, and you're trying to make a difference to young people's lives. And quite honestly, they